Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Nyman. I'm a senior principal at GeoSyntech Consultants and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's event. Today's webinar focuses on DoD-funded research efforts to improve natural resource management by better understanding how disturbance and climate variability impact DoD lands. First, Dr. Allison Luthen of Kansas State University and Dr. Bill Morris of Duke University will discuss cross-jurisdictional management of Venus flytrap populations. Next, Dr. Ashley Long of Louisiana State University and Mr. John Macy of the United States Army will talk about the use of remotely sensed data and light-level geolocator technology to inform off-post landscape scale conservation planning for the golden-cheeked warbler. Each presentation will be followed by a brief question and answer session, and we will conclude the webinar with a final Q&A session. The next few slides provide some instructions for today's webinar. If you haven't done so already, you can download Zoom at the link shown here and provide it to you in your webinar registration confirmation email. If you can't download Zoom, you may view the slides using an internet browser like Firefox, IE, or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you are still unable to view the slides or if your screen freezes, try keying Control with F5 to perform a hard refresh. For audio issues, if you are accessing the audio through your computer, you can click the arrow next to the Join Audio button. Then select Test Speaker and Microphone and follow the prompts. If you continue to experience difficulties, call into the conference line, which is shown here. You can also submit a comment using the chat box, but please use the chat box only for comments related to technical difficulties. The Q&A box on the Zoom platform should be reserved for questions for the speakers. If you continue to have any technical difficulties, know that you can always download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage and call into the conference line provided to you in your confirmation email. We will also be live streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only. You may submit questions by using the Q&A box on your screen and typing them in. You don't have to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions in advance of that session. When you submit a question, please add your organizational name at the end of your question so that we can identify you. And with that, I would like to introduce Kevin Hires, who serves as the SERDP and ESTCP Program Manager for the Resource Conservation and Resilience Program area. In this capacity, Kevin is responsible for identifying strategic research needs to support conservation, climate adaptation, environmental security, ecosystem management, and wildland fire management on DoD installations. He received his master's degree in conservation ecology from the University of Georgia. Kevin.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. The next few slides will provide a quick overview of SERDP and ESTCP. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. It was established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology demonstration or development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition those technologies to the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs with much of the SERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale with experimental field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, though occasionally support lab efforts. There are several environmental drivers for the type of work funded under SERDP and ESTCP. with the underlying objective of sustaining DoD ranges, facilities, and operations. This is a broad undertaking, and it includes looking at maritime sustainability, threatened and endangered species, climate impacts, unexploded ordnance, and munitions constituents, as well as other environmental drivers. One key environmental driver is the reduction of current and future environmental liabilities. This involves addressing contamination from past practices, including impacts to groundwater, soil and sediments, UXO contamination, endangered species recovery, and developing management approaches for contaminants of emerging concern. The second part of this is pollution prevention, with a focus on eliminating chemicals of concern or hazardous materials in manufacturing, maintenance, and operations on our installations. We have several main focus areas for research and demonstration at SERDP and ESTCP shown here. As mentioned earlier, technology transfer is particularly important within the SERDP and ESTCP programs. Technology transfer efforts include the development of videos, training workshops, and guidance documents. The webinar series is a substantial component of our technology transfer efforts. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts for all of our program areas. Upcoming topics include enhanced sensing for detailed surveys for munitions detection and localization in shallow water, and forensic methods for PFAS source tracking and allocation. Registration is open for webinars through the beginning of next year. The 2024 webinar schedule will be released later this month. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. All past webinars are archived and can be accessed using this link. Please note that the 2023 symposium, which will be held between Tuesday, November 28th and Friday, December 1st in Arlington, Virginia. You can register for the symposium and view the program agenda at the link shown here. Finally, I would like to remind you that a copy of today's presentation and session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. Hope that you enjoyed today's webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's first pair of speakers. First, Dr. Allison Luthen is an assistant professor at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. She is a population ecologist whose work focuses on how species interactions and climate change jointly influence plant population dynamics, with a particular focus on threatened and rare species and on impacts of large mammal herbivory on plant populations and communities. Allison received her doctoral degree from the University of Colorado Boulder. Next, Dr. Bill Morris is a professor of biology at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. His research uses mathematical models fitted to field data to assess the impacts of environmental changes, including climate change, on the geographical distributions and abundances of plant and animal species. Bill received a doctoral degree in zoology from the University of Washington. Allison, please proceed.
Thanks so much. I'm very excited to be here today and looking forward to hearing some questions and having some interesting discussion. So I'm going to start by talking about, today we're going to talk about how DoD might leverage some metapopulation biology ideas to try to reduce the management burden for a species of concern, Venus flytrap. So I'll talk about the project overview and then talk through some data collection efforts. So I'll talk first about the theory behind how coordinated management among DoD jurisdictions might reduce extinction risk from a theoretical viewpoint. I'll then talk about the effects of management actions for Venus flytrap, our sort of focal species for this webinar. And then I'll make some explicit recommendations for coordinated management among jurisdictions that DoD could leverage to help reduce extinction risk. I'll then talk about climate change effects on those recommendations, or how climate change might change those recommendations. And then Dr. Morris will conclude with talking about conclusions and some more benefits to the Department of Defense. So from a theoretical standpoint, coordinated management could improve outcomes due to asynchrony. And so here's what I mean by that. Most species of concern, many species of concern from the Department of Defense occur at multiple jurisdictions. So for example, maybe a particular species occurs at one jurisdiction, J1 and J2, and also occurs at J3, so 3 different jurisdictions here. If a particular species exhibits synchronous dynamics across a subset of the species range, so for example, maybe at J1 and J2, changes in abundance on the y-axis over time are synchronous. So what that means is that population numbers are high in 1981 or 1982. They decline in 1987. And they do that at both J1 and J2. So those 2 populations or those 2 jurisdictions are exhibiting synchronous dynamics. Because total population size across those 2 populations will decline to very low numbers at both J1 and J2 and in 1987. What that means is that those low numbers in 1987 of total abundance will increase extinction risk of this particular population. So if that particular species only occurred at J1 and J2, its extinction risk in 1987 would be very high, and thus it would be of concern to the Department of Defense. By contrast, if J3 exhibits asynchronous population dynamics, this will actually reduce extinction risk. So for example, J3 is over here, and maybe it has low population densities at the same time that J1 and J2 have high population densities. And then as abundances at J1 and J2 decline to very low numbers in 1987, population abundances at J3 are very high. And so that asynchrony will actually reduce extinction risk because J3 will have high numbers, even though J1 and J2 have very low numbers. So this synchrony or asynchrony could be driven by a variety of factors, including shared environmental conditions. So for example, at J1 and J2, maybe in 1987 happened to be a very cold year. And because J1 and J2 are very close together, they experience the same environmental conditions, the same cold year in 1987 that reduces their population densities or their abundances in that particular year. But J3 is very far away from J1 and J2. And so instead of experiencing a cold year in 1987, it experiences a hot year in 1987. And that hot year actually increases its population densities or its abundance to high numbers. And so these shared environmental conditions at J1 and J2 are actually driving synchrony at J1 and J2. And driving asynchrony at J3, where who doesn't have shared environmental conditions. Shared management actions might also drive synchrony. So for example, if a particular management action, such as burning, reduces population densities in, say, 1998 at J1 and J2, maybe it's very easy to burn these in the same year because they're right next to each other. And so they're burned in the same year. That will induce synchrony in J1 and J2 because they're experiencing this shared management action. If J3 does not experience that shared management action, it will exhibit asynchrony because of the lack of shared management actions. Potentially J3 experienced that management action in 1982 when J1 and J2 actually experienced high population densities. So theoretically, these shared management actions could induce asynchrony in populations and thus reduce extinction risk. Another thing that's important to know about synchrony is that dispersal could also affect it. So let's say that J3 has high densities in 1998. Those high densities in 1998 could result in a net export of migrants from J3 to J1 and J2, and thus increase synchrony in population dynamics simply through dispersal. So to understand the impact of shared management actions or shared environmental conditions, you must know sort of the magnitude and degree of dispersal in this system. So how could the Department of Defense use these ideas to reduce the management burden for any species? So if synchrony elevates extinction risk and asynchronous management actions could reduce synchrony, you could imagine how asynchronous management actions could actually reduce extinction risk. But of course, this depends on the degree of dispersal for a particular species. So for example, let's pretend a particular species occurs at J1, J2, J3, and J4. If dispersal is low, you would want to engage in a management action at J1 only and leave J2 alone, or not engage in that management action at J2. And that asynchrony will actually reduce extinction risk, right? Because these two populations are not strongly connected via dispersal. You'd want to do the same thing over here at J3 and J4. If dispersal is very high, J1 and J2 are functionally the same population because there's such high dispersal between them. So it would make sense to burn J1 and J2 together, right, which is relatively easy from a management perspective in terms of fire control. And so you'd want to burn these two together, or you could burn those two together and then enforce asynchrony with this other patch over here that's also strongly connected via dispersal. So our project, funded through the Department of Defense for 3 species of conservation concern, worked to construct spatially explicit population models that predict abundances at different jurisdictions across the landscape. We then use those population models to construct what-if scenarios that allowed us to test for the impacts of particular management actions, including the time that those management actions were conducted, and then also allowed us to ask about the impact of acquiring particular land parcels to ask about how that would impact extinction risk of these 3 species. The 3 species, excuse me, the 3 species that we conducted this work on are St. Francis satyr, which is a butterfly endemic to Fort Liberty. St. Francis satyr is dependent on wetland restoration, so we thought that perhaps asynchronous management of wetlands could actually enforce asynchrony of population dynamics within Fort Liberty and reduce extinction risk. We also worked on the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is endemic to Southeast longleaf pine ecosystems. It's affected by climate. And so we thought that proximate populations might exhibit synchrony that could increase extinction risk. But today I'll focus on our work on the Venus flytrap. The Venus flytrap is endemic to North Carolina, and it's strongly dependent on fire. So we'll talk today about how asynchronous management across different jurisdictions could actually reduce extinction risks for this particular species. So in order to sort of understand our recommendations, you have to know a little bit about Venus flytrap ecology. So Venus flytrap lives in longleaf pine savannas. I'm showing you here a picture of what those looked like historically. So you can see that these are relatively open savannas. They have tall trees and sort of a grassy understory layer here. It's mostly wiregrass. And these open savannas are maintained by fire. So when a fire sort of goes through this ecosystem, as you can see here, it burns this understory layer, but it does not reach into the upper canopy. So these fires are relatively cool for fires. They're not very intense fires, essentially. And these fires are really necessary to maintain these open savannas because as they burn, they kill any small trees that are sort of present in that landscape that would have grown up to sort of have lots of more trees in that system. So you can see here that in this landscape, this is Dr. Morris measuring some Venus flytrap in a very wet microsite where it likes to occur. You can see that Venus flytrap really likes to live in these very wet microsites. Actually, it's living underwater in that particular picture. So we wanted to measure how annual fluctuations in abundance are occurring at multiple jurisdictions for Venus flytrap. We also wanted to measure how annual fluctuations in abundance respond to particular management actions to understand if we could leverage that response to generate asynchrony in population dynamics. So to do this, at each of 3 jurisdictions, we quantified all demographic rates that control annual abundance. I'll talk about those a little bit in the next slide. We also quantified at each of those jurisdictions the number of years since fire, or the number of years since a particular management action, fire in this case. We also quantified temperature and precipitation, which we know could affect population dynamics. We then regressed each demographic rate against these 2 abiotic drivers, climate drivers, and number of years since fire. And we combined all of these rates into a model that predicted annual abundances, and in particular, the effect of management actions and climate variables on annual abundances. And I'll just tell you, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but I'll just tell you that we use these data as well as other data from introduced populations in Florida to estimate dispersal. And we found that dispersal was actually very limited in the system, less than a meter per year. So in this particular species, dispersal is very, very low. So the data on demographic rates that we collected are shown here. So a Venus flytrap starts as a seedling, which then grows and survives to become an adult. That adult reproduces to make flowers and seeds, which then recruit into seedlings to influence population growth. The jurisdictions at which we worked are located in North and South Carolina. Fort Liberty is here at the western part of the species range, which is shown in the green colors. And Camp Lejeune is another jurisdiction at which we worked. And then we worked in the Croatan National Forest. Both of those 2 latter areas were on the coast here. So I'll just jump right into the results here. So what we found is that management actions, in particular fire return interval, strongly influenced population growth rate. So I'll tell you what population growth rate is before we proceed. So if the log of population growth rate, shown here on the y-axis, is greater than 0, what that means is that populations are able to sustain themselves over time. If that value is less than 0, that means that populations are unable to sustain themselves over time. Essentially, they're destined for extinction. So on the y-axis, we have that particular metric, and then on the x-axis, we have fire return interval. Fire return intervals that are 1 or 2 indicate that fires burned every 1 or 2 years, and long, big fire return intervals indicate a long time between fires. So that greatest value there is 18 years between fires. So what we found is that our management action had strong impacts on population growth rate. Just after a fire, population growth rate was very low. So essentially, fires hurt Venus flytrap initially, but as kind of Venus flytrap was able to recover, they increased in performance until about 10 years since fire, at which point they started declining in performance, likely due to competition and sort of woody plants encroaching and shading them out here. And that process led to an optimal fire return interval of around 10 or 11. And so what this means for extinction risk and management actions for Venus flytrap is that if you burn, say, one jurisdiction, right, that's right next to another jurisdiction, remember that these are not strongly connected via dispersal because dispersal is very low in this system. That fire will initially have strong negative impacts on population growth rate at J1. If J2 and J3 are sort of at longer fire return intervals, they'll have higher population growth rate. As J1 recovers, it will have higher population growth rates, and you could then burn J2 or J3, and that will initially reduce population growth rate, but then eventually the Venus flytrap will recover. Remember that you have to burn in this system pretty regularly for the savannas to stay open and for Venus flytrap to have appropriate habitat. One complication about our study is that we did find this optimal fire return interval at around 10 or 11. But historical fire return interval in this system is much shorter. Like at the most, it's around 3. And this was really surprising to us. And we think what might be happening here is that fire return interval here measures actually the frequency at which Venus flytrap populations themselves were burnt, not the whole landscape that's sort of surrounding it. So it may be, right, that at these very wet microsites at which the Venus flytrap occurs, maybe only about 1 in 3 fires is able to reach into those microsites and really burn those populations. So that landscape level fire return interval of say 2 or 3 might actually translate to a fire return interval experienced by Venus flytrap of much longer, like 10 in this case. Another explanation for why our sort of fire return interval might actually not be reflective of Venus flytrap performance in this system is that these 3 jurisdictions, or these areas at which we measured Venus flytrap performance, actually all occur in areas where fires have been suppressed for a long time. So if fires have been suppressed for a long time, what that means is that there's a lot of woody encroachment, a lot of trees that are around. And when those trees burn, when a fire does occur, they burn at very, very hot temperatures. And so what that would do is actually depress population growth rate substantially. And because those fires are so hot, it takes a very long time for Venus flytrap to recover. So we think, though we're going to test this hopefully in future work, we think that in areas that have not been subject to fire suppression, the optimal fire return interval might actually be quite a bit shorter. So I told you that I would explain to you how climate change modifies management recommendations. And I'll just tell you that it doesn't, like it does not. So here I'm showing you the graph that I showed you in black was actually the response of fire or of population growth rate to fire under past climate conditions. But if we ask what the impact of fire return interval is under future projected climate conditions, we see a very similar response. So we see this optimal fire return interval of 10 or 12 right here. And we see that at least at these populations that have a history of fire suppression, that fire return interval, fires really depress population growth rate, and we see this sort of optimal recovery. We see them recover at sort of longer fire return intervals, suggesting that this asynchronous burning regime could actually work very well in this system, or in a climate change system too. And with that, I'd like to...
Before I start summarizing the conclusions and DoD benefits, I just wanted to expand a little bit on something Allison just said about why we think fire suppression may be an important thing to consider. So as Allison showed, we collected the data in the model that produced the results she showed from Fort Liberty, Camp Lejeune, and Croatan National Forest. These are all areas that have experienced either substantial fire suppression, in particular the Croatan, or in which fire management often is not intense enough to burn into the wetland areas where Venus flytrap occurs, which is true in Fort Liberty and Camp Lejeune. So since we collected those data, we've begun to collect data at the Green Swamp, which is a preserve of the Nature Conservancy, which is rigorously burned every 2 years by Nature Conservancy managers. And what we think we may see is that if we use data for an area in which the fire management is much more frequent, we might convert this picture from the one that Allison showed to the sort of hypothetical curve on the left, which shows both that the optimal fire management, fire return interval might be closer to 3 years, that is closer to the historical average, and that burning at that frequency might actually lead to higher peak population growth rate. And so what this suggests is that we may need to go through a transition period where fires have not been frequent or intense enough to a period in which better fire management leads to better outcomes and a different recommendation about what the optimum fire return interval is. So just to conclude with some of the important points we've made, a consistent pattern we find is that an intermediate fire frequency is best for increasing the population growth rate because of the balance between negative effects of fire on the short term and beneficial effects of fire on the longer term. We don't want to burn either too frequently or too infrequently. Our results also suggest that asynchronous management may be important, both across jurisdictions, for example, between Fort Liberty and Camp Lejeune in the range of Venus flytraps, but it might also be important between regions or areas within a single jurisdiction, for example, within different burn blocks in these DoD installations. And the last thing that Allison showed us is that the optimal management interval might actually change with climate change, but the recommendation that an intermediate optimum interval is best is robust to changes in climate. The important benefits of this work to DoD are that it suggests that fire frequency is something to consider in aiding management of species of concern, and the quantitative tools, in particular the population models we have developed in this project, are useful for DoD managers in areas where flytrap occurs, for example, to design the optimal fire frequency. Our results clearly recommend maintaining asynchrony, even on a small scale, because of the limited dispersal ability of Venus flytrap. We need to keep populations producing seeds close to populations that have recently experienced negative effects of fire, so that one location can benefit populations in a nearby location, given limited dispersal. This also suggests that our results are potentially useful to managing other species, which might be managed in different ways than with fire. But if they're dispersal limited, we again want to consider using management to maintain an appropriate spatial scale of population synchrony. And with that, we will stop and take any questions.
Great. Thank you both very much. And I'd like to remind our audience at this time that you can go to the box on your Zoom platform that says Q&A and type in questions for Bill and for Allison. And so we have received a number of questions. The first is that, Allison, the graphs that you showed indicated that the Venus flytrap would be predicted to go extinct with the historical burn rate. Could you explain what's happening with that, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do know from other data that abundance data that have been collected through, I think, the Nature Conservancy, that the populations aren't necessarily doing the best. So some of those data are sort of congruent with kind of independent estimates. Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here. But I also think that those results actually are really strongly dependent on the degree of recruitment that's in our models. So essentially the probability that a seed transitions into a seedling, so like seed germination. And I don't think have a very good handle on what those rates are, in part because they're very difficult to measure. And I think that we need to improve those estimates. And I will say that I don't think that those estimates will sort of change this idea that asynchronous management is still a really useful tool for the Department of Defense, but they could change sort of the overarching pattern, or the idea of like, should this species be extinct or not? Our data certainly suggests that they do, but obviously that's not correct because it's not extinct.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there an example of how this the set of data on the Venus flytraps has been incorporated into a prescribed burn?
Yeah, so we, in collaboration with very helpful people at Fort Liberty, have done actually some prescribed burns or sort of experimental burns, in part to kind of get a better handle on what exactly happens right after a fire. And we haven't analyzed those data yet. And so we don't know, but we are sort of actively trying to do sort of small scale experimental burns that really rigorously say right after a fire, what happens? And in particular, right after a fire, how does recruitment change, for example, or how does survival change, or how do these demographic rates change? I think that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. Next, how does a fire strategy for a specific species, like you are talking about here, affect other biological species in terms of overall ecosystem health? So how do you consider all species in a single strategy for prescribed burns? And this is a question from the California Department of Toxic Substances Control.
That's a great question. I mean, presumably, if all members of a community have been extant in that or present in that community since, for a very, very long time, probably they would have all evolved to show similar responses to a similar fire frequency, right? So that if we see, say, an optimal fire frequency of 3, it's likely that other species that are in that community, right, are also like well adapted to that. That's not for sure, I would say, but it seems sort of probable. We do know in this system from like fire scars on trees that this area was burned every, I think, 2 to 3 years. 3 years is sort of the maximum of what we think was happening in this system. And so it seems to me that the best thing to do, while considering, right, all of these species that are all responding to fire return interval in potentially similar ways, but likely with some differences, right, that it's probably best to, try to mimic what happened historically and hope that it sort of helps the most species, right? I don't think it's a good management strategy to say, well, for this particular species that we care about, it requires this sort of fire return interval that's very different than all other members of the community. That's not a very good ecological management strategy, though if that particular species that requires a strange fire return interval is one that DoD wants to sort of preserve, that sort of presents a conundrum, I would say.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Allison. This question is from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. What are some of the benefits of the Venus flytrap to the ecosystem? And do you consider whether there are other fire-resistant species that could offer similar ecosystem services?
That is a great question. Bill, do you want to take this one?
Well, there are the longleaf pine savannas are famous for the diversity of carnivorous plants, not only Venus flytrap, but also pitcher plants, sundews, etc. So it's possible that they're all serving similar roles in consuming insect prey or arthropod prey, to be more general. So whether they're serving similar ecosystem functions, I think, is yet to be seen. But I think they are all quite fire adapted, because they have to be to live in this habitat.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Next question for Allison. Venus flytrap is a plant, but many species of concern are animals that disperse much longer distances. Do you think that animal species can benefit from asynchronous management?
That's a great question. So I would, if you're up for it, whoever asked that, encourage you to read our report online, because our report does contain sort of similar recommendations for other species, including 2 animal species that have kind of, substantial dispersal. So the St. Francis satyr is one of those that is a butterfly. So it does not disperse as much as the other species that we worked on, which is the red-cuccated woodpecker. I'm trying to remember what we found for those species. So the butterfly, we found kind of a similar result, I think, because it doesn't disperse very far. So if you kind of, and in particular, it also kind of stays in patches that are sort of appropriate for it. So it has kind of directed movement. So in that scenario, if you engage in wetland restoration in one particular stream, right, and then in the next year, you engage in it in a different stream, the sort of succession of species that occur after that restoration process sort of result in a very similar kind of management recommendation for that particular species. And then for red-cuccated woodpecker, Bill, do you want to take this one too? Is that possible?
Well, it's territorial, so the birds stay within a certain area that may be within a single burn block, but over all of Fort Liberty or Camp Lejeune, which are the 2 of the largest remaining populations of RCW red-cuccated woodpecker anywhere, I think it's still true that asynchronous burning across a jurisdiction or across a DoD base would probably be the best way to maintain healthy populations of red-cuccated woodpecker. There's even some reports of dispersal between bases, but that's probably extremely rare. But they're certainly able to disperse across entire bases, whereas the St. Francis satyr has dispersal more on the order of 50 meters. So I think the bigger point is you want to establish the scale of management to match the scale of dispersal of the species of interest, which may differ. The challenge, of course, is, as one of the earlier questions asked, what happens when species with different dispersal abilities occur on the same landscape? You can't have different scales of management in the same place, but maybe you could have different regions within a large jurisdiction where you manage mostly for short dispersal species and other regions where you manage mostly for long dispersal species.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We have just one last question for you for this question and answer session. It's an interesting thought experiment. If there is spatiotemporal heterogeneity in a fire that prevents the fire from reaching all of the areas of the wetlands, would the result be effectively natural asynchronous management within a single fire?
That is a great question. And I think, yes, like that would definitely be the case. That you would, in some patches, right, where the fire either burned or, I guess, yeah, burned, you would see lower population growth rate in that particular patch. And in a very proximate patch, right, that had that did not burn, right, you would see relatively high population growth rate, resulting in very small scale asynchrony. And also, right, those 2 patches that are both asynchronous and they're very close together. And so you might imagine that you could have sort of a rescue effect, right? One patch is having a lot of seed production and it sort of gives seeds, right to the next patch, even if dispersal is very, very short. I will say that in this landscape, I showed that picture of fires burning, sort of the understory habitat. My sense is that as far as fires go, these fires are not super heterogeneous, at least at the scale of Venus flytrap, where you have these sort of very small patches. There's definitely some heterogeneity, as there are in all fires, but I don't think that's a huge effect that's going to be strongly influencing Venus flytrap population growth rates, at least on a very small scale, because many of these sort of areas are in places that aren't super sort of topographically complex, I guess.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much, Allison. And thank you, Bill, for the presentation. And Allison and Bill will come back at the end of the webinar to answer a few additional questions too. So now we will move to our second presentation, which is also going to be delivered by two speakers. The first is Dr. Ashley Long, who is an assistant professor of wildlife ecology at Louisiana State University's School of Renewable Natural Resources. As a wildlife extension specialist, her research focuses on how vegetation management practices, human activity, and infrastructure development influence species distributions, movements, and wildlife population dynamics. And Ashley received a doctoral degree in wildlife and fisheries from Texas A&M University. The second speaker is John Macy, who is an endangered species biologist and the lead golden-cheeked warbler biologist at Fort Hood Army Installation in Texas. He has spent most of his career working for the U.S. Army on wildlife population monitoring, habitat restoration, endangered species management, and other species of conservational concern. John received bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from Stephen F. Austin State University, and he is currently a doctoral candidate at Texas A&M University. Ashley, please go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you for the introduction. Before we begin, we'd like to extend our gratitude to SERDP and the program staff for funding and support of our project, and to everyone who's on the webinar today. We're really excited to share the results of our work. Here's a general roadmap for our presentation. First, we're going to provide some background information for our project. We'll give an overview of our project's objectives, review our main results, provide concluding remarks, and then outline the benefits of our project to DoD. A few years back, we responded to an SON requesting advanced approaches for management of species and ecosystems in a non-stationary world. This is an important topic because identifying focus areas for multi-agency conservation efforts on landscapes, especially those that include DoD facilities, is essential for maintaining populations of T&E species and protecting the defense mission. Achieving this goal requires that we know where species occur, the timing of their movements, and how their habitats might change over time. We lack at least some of this information for most migratory songbirds, which are often too small for tracking devices. But these data are critical because threats that impact any one part of a migratory species' annual cycle can affect the entire population. Our focal species for this study was the golden-cheeked warbler. Now, this is a small endangered migratory songbird that breeds in central Texas from early spring to midsummer. Warblers use mature ash juniper woodland for nesting, and this tree species composition is really an important aspect of warbler breeding habitat. Warblers use strips of mature ash juniper bark to build their cup-shaped nests, and they use ash juniper, oaks, and other deciduous tree species for foraging. The warbler's habitat in Texas is well defined and includes DoD facilities Fort Cavazos and JBSA Camp Bullis. Based on the species description, migration was thought to occur exclusively along the eastern Sierra Madres with no previous evidence of trans-Gulf migrations. And also based on the species description, they're known to winter in pine oak forests from southern Mexico and into Central America. There are 3 published models of warbler winter habitat, but prior to the current study, the models covered a relatively small spatial extent and represented conditions that were present over 20 years ago. Now, on both the breeding and the wintering grounds, habitat and loss and fragmentation are the biggest threats to warblers. On the warblers' breeding grounds, this includes urbanization along the Interstate 35 corridor, where both Fort Cavazos and JBSA Camp Bullis are located. Our specific objectives for this project were to develop an updated winter habitat model and identify areas at highest risk of habitat conversion, We also used miniaturized tracking technology, specifically geolocators, to examine warbler movements during non-breeding seasons. And then we wanted to develop tools that could help manage risk during all stages of a species life cycle. So first, we used environmental and occurrence data to update the warbler's winter habitat model. Ultimately, we used 3 regression-based algorithms and 5 machine learning algorithms, then combined our predictions to create an ensemble model for this. We found that the probability of warbler occurrence declined with increasing temperatures during wet season and with increasing precipitation in winter. Now, based on our results, we found about 104,000 square kilometers of potential warbler habitat on the wintering grounds. We found that about 20% of that occurs on formally protected lands. More than 80% of that predicted habitat occurred in Honduras, Guatemala, and Chiapas, Mexico. And as you'll see later on in our presentation, our geolocator data supported relatively high use of these areas, at least compared to other portions of the predicted range. We also quantified losses that occurred on the warbler's wintering grounds and found that loss was about 1% every 5 years from 2001 to 2015, and twice that from 2016 to 2019. When we looked at where that loss was occurring, it appeared to be highest in Honduras compared to the other regions. In addition, for this portion of our study, we forecasted the winter distribution model out to 2050 under different climate scenarios and under 4 global change models. Under the most optimistic example, we were expected to lose about 43,000 square kilometers of potential warbler habitat on the wintering grounds. And we found that the highest forecasted losses occurred in Chiapas, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to my collaborator, John, who's going to describe how we explored movements of the warbler during non-breeding seasons.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I'm going to start with a brief background on geolocators and other tracking devices. Data to describe the spatial and temporal distributions of migratory birds can be very difficult to collect because most species travel long distances across environmental barriers, multiple land use and land tenure types, and across jurisdictional boundaries during their annual cycle. Migratory birds also exhibit complex behaviors with respect to timing of their movements, which vary by species and are influenced by genetics, hormones, sex, age, body condition, and resource availability, among others. In addition, migratory birds are incredibly diverse with respect to size and shape, which requires a wide range of research techniques and expertise to study their movements. And from a natural resource perspective, overcoming these challenges for listed and at-risk migratory birds is critical, as threats that impact any one part of a migratory bird's annual cycle can infect the entire population. And when it comes to tracking birds, devices that work with GPS or satellite technologies require birds to weigh 80 grams or more due to the size of the device. And golden cheek warblers only weigh between 8 and 12 grams. So when we began our research, miniaturized light-level geolocators were the only devices light enough to track the bird's locations over time. And geolocators have an internal clock and records light intensity at regular intervals, which researchers can later use these data to estimate the latitude and longitude of a bird's location based on sunrise, sunset, and solar noon times. And there are a couple of limitations associated with geolocators. First of all, they are an archival data logger, which means individuals must be recaptured to offload the data. And secondly, geolocators do not have the same precision as GPS and satellite transmitters, typically ranges between 50 and 200 kilometers. And lastly, the accuracy of the light data depends on many factors, including location, bird behavior, weather, and habitat. But over the past decade or so, many researchers have used geolocators to examine bird migration routes, overwintering locations, sex and age-based differences in migration strategies. And these studies have typically included species that weigh over 12 grams. But the miniaturized geolocator you see here circled in red and attached with the leg loop backpack harness weighs only about 0.41 gram, allowing us to attach them to golden cheek warblers. Golden cheek warblers were a very good candidate for this technology because they have high annual return rates, high site fidelity, meaning they return to the same location in subsequent breeding seasons, and we had a long-term monitoring data available to assess any potential impacts that the devices were having on individuals. And if you look at the picture, there are two options when it comes to geolocators. One device, such as the one in the picture, has a light pipe that extends above the feathers like a periscope to capture the light intensity. The other device does not. So we opted for the device with the light pipe to limit the potential for feather shading that would impact the quality of our data. And in total, we deployed 309 geolocators on male warblers from 2017 to 2020 at 5 study sites across the warblers breeding range in Texas. We monitored warblers with and without geolocators during the breeding season, and we, in total, recaptured 80 birds with geolocators during subsequent seasons. In total, we were able to use data from 61 devices for final analysis, and 90% of the geolocators recorded both fall and spring migration. And similar to other passerings, fall migration was slightly longer than spring migration. This may be driven by day length, stronger prevailing winds in the spring, and differences in food availability between the two seasons. In addition, early spring arrivals may have higher reproductive success. And a very interesting note was that all of the departure and arrival dates spanned over a 2-month period. Here are the maps that represent fall migration on the left and spring migration on the right, with the migration routes illustrated with 25, 50, and 75% utilization distributions. And in total, 80% migrated both migrations along the eastern Sierra Madres, which aligns with current species description for this portion of their annual life cycle. However, 20% migrated once over the Gulf, with many traveling further east before crossing the Gulf, with 11 of these trans-Gulf migrations occurring in the fall and 1 in the spring, with an almost even split of younger and older birds. And there have been incidental sightings along these eastward paths that support our results. However, it still remains unclear why some birds might choose a trans-Gulf migration path, as we didn't find any evidence that age or the timing of their departure influenced the routes. But prevailing winds or food availability might explain some of these movement behavior. And on the left, the highest concentration of stopovers is along the Sierra Madre, as expected, with a few scattered in other locations. On the right is a stopover by duration, with the larger the circle, the longer the stopover period. The longest durations occur in South Texas and northeastern Mexico. And once again, it is still unclear why stopover duration may vary, but it could be linked to factors such as body condition, weather, predation risk, resources, density of conspecifics, and additional research is needed to explore these potential mechanisms, but it would be extremely challenging to do so. The map on the left illustrates the 75% utilization distribution and mean overwintering locations for individuals. And overall, they spent 165 days on the wintering grounds. And on the right, when we combine their location data to determine the areas with the greatest concentration of wintering location points, we see that a majority occur within just 3 locations: Chiapas, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras, providing data to support the need for continued and increased conservation efforts in those regions. And in addition, our results have already helped researchers on the wintering grounds find new locations of warblers. Interestingly, some individuals had multiple overwintering locations with on average 1.6 winter locations per individual. As you can see by the red circles at the bottom, the single and the split overwintering locations. So many warblers are not stationary during the winter period. So what is migratory connectivity and why is it important? It describes the degree of cohesion of individuals between two periods. For example, the figure on the left illustrates strong migratory connectivity as individuals from the same breeding area stay together on the winter grounds. And in general, they are better adapted to local conditions, but localized threats could have a more profound impact. While the figure on the right illustrates weak migratory connectivity as the individuals mix on the wintering grounds. And in general, they are more resilient to local threats such as impacts to resources and those from natural disasters, and they may exhibit genetic variation in their migration behavior, such as the direction and timing of the migration. And typically, these individuals can adapt to changes on the breeding or the wintering grounds. We use Mantell's correlation coefficient to quantify migratory connectivity. This correlation coefficient suggests weak migratory connectivity is indicated by the score of 0.04. And we found the same results when we broke the data down by year. And as mentioned earlier, weak migratory connectivity typically indicates that the individuals are more resilient to local threats. However, for the golden cheek, habitat loss and degradation on the wintering range could still be problematic simply because they occur within such a small geographic area. And even though advancements in tracking technologies have provided unprecedented movement data, they have simultaneously raised questions about how the devices affect behavior and survival, especially for very small songbirds. So we examined the potential impacts of geolocators on warblers at Fort Cavazos and Camp Bullis. 17% of the recaptured individuals had minor feather abrasions and skin irritations from the backpack harness and the geolocator. However, all of the individuals, when we released them with the geolocator, resumed normal activity within 30 minutes of deployment, and most of them resumed normal activity immediately upon release. And we found no differences in body mass when we compared before and after the individuals carried the geolocators. And with few exceptions, we found no differences in the warbler pairing success, fledging success, or return rates when we compared birds with and without geolocators. And here are some examples of where we did find some statistical differences, with both being age-related. On the left, we did find a significant difference in fledging success at Fort Cavazos between older birds without geolocators and younger birds with geolocators. That difference in fledging success was about 44%. But ultimately, there was no difference within age classes, and the rates for both age groups were similar to long-term estimates at Fort Cavazos and other sites. And younger birds are historically known to be less productivity. And on the right, we find that return rates for younger birds with geolocators was 64% lower than younger birds without geolocators at Camp Bullis. However, we had an unusually high return rate for younger birds without geolocators, higher than anything that has ever been recorded for this species to date. And overall, return rates were similar to long-term estimates at Fort Cavazos and at other sites. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashley to discuss other results from our project and to wrap up the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Another aspect of our project was to develop tools that could be used to help inform off-post landscape scale conservation planning that manages risks during all stages of a species life cycle. One of the things we did was develop a web-based mapping tool in Google Earth Engine so that users could visualize and analyze the spatial data associated with our project. Now, Google Earth Engine has an extensive data catalog and cloud computing capabilities that are really useful for the large spatial extent and the multiple geographic regions that we included in our project. Furthermore, it's really flexible. So we chose this platform because it would allow us to update the application as new information becomes available. Here's a screenshot of the landing page for that particular application. So we have a route panel on the right, and that route panel has different layers in it. There are habitat models, locations of protected areas, imagery, both land use and land cover layers, and projections. And users can use the legend in the bottom left-hand portion of this screen to turn those layers off and on and to see the definitions of those layers. And then here's a screenshot of our app that's showing our winter models. So in addition to viewing where the warbler occurs, users can draw polygons around an area of interest and extract information, both in the form of spatial layers and graphs about the size and location of warbler habitat, current habitat use or land use, and the locations of formerly protected lands, and then also projected change. Ultimately, we're hoping that this provides a tool that people can use to help drive locations of future conservation actions that would be biologically relevant for the species. Further, we think this app really demonstrates an approach that could be used for other species and regions. Now, as with any mapping application, there's error and uncertainty in all models. So apps like these should really be used as a guide, but then practitioners should evaluate any potential plans prior to implementation and then conduct monitoring during implementation to ensure that those activities are meeting their desired goals. In conclusion, we filled critical knowledge gaps for the movement ecology of an endangered species, which could contribute to the ongoing species status assessment and help identify timing and locations for future surveys in non-breeding habitat. We also demonstrated the use of miniaturized tracking technologies on small, long-distance migrants, which has implications for avian ecology in general, especially in light of recent studies that suggest we've lost over 3 million North American songbirds since 1970. The drivers of these population declines are species-specific, but there is growing evidence that events during non-breeding periods may play a considerable role. And unfortunately, we still lack data to describe winter habitat associations and migratory behavior for most species. This type of information is really necessary to develop and implement more effective conservation strategies that address concerns across a bird's full annual cycle. In terms of benefits to DoD, our project provided data and tools that could help with conservation planning for the warbler, which is necessary to ensure population persistence and protect on-post training capabilities, and also demonstrated methods that could be applicable to other DoD mission-sensitive species. DoD has a long history of participating in these landscape scale partnerships and proactive stewardship that helps maintain and improve habitat for species that occur beyond the fence. And we believe that the approaches we described today add even more options to our collective conservation toolbox. Our project team consisted of both myself and John Macy, who presented today, as well as many biologists at universities, military bases, and federal agencies. We really can't thank everyone enough for each role that they played in the success of our project. We're going to give a particular shout out to the field technicians who helped collect data on the ground. We really could not have done this without a huge team of technicians and volunteers during each field season. And with that, we would like to thank you for your time, and we would be happy to move on to the Q&A section of the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley and John. And Ashley, the first question is about the last item that you presented. Is the map tool available to the public?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's not currently available to the public, but it should be soon.
Great. Ashley, if you want to take this question or pass it on, the question is, were there any differences in return rates between tagged and non-tagged birds? Can you tell that?
Yes, also thank you for that question. It's a great one. John, I'm going to turn that one over to you, and unless you'd like me to take it.
Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. Were there any differences in return rates between the tagged and the non-tagged birds?
Yes, let me go to that slide real quick on my end. Yeah, so the only one that was statistically significant, if you look at the slide that shows the geolocator impacts, Ashley, can you put it on that? So if you look on the right graph there, after second year class, which is the older birds, there was no statistically significant differences within age classes. But if you look a little to the right there, the second year birds with geolocators was significantly less return rate than those without geolocators. However, just a few caveats about this. If you look at the geolocator birds the non-geolocator birds, our return rate was at 74%, which was 11% higher return rate than anything we could find on our historic data here at Fort Cavazos or anywhere else. And also the geolocator birds, we had a very small sample size of only about 13. So even though it shows very significant here, maybe in reality, the difference is not so much.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Ashley, how has tracking technology changed for small songbirds since you started your project?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great one. It's incredible to see the advances that have happened over even just the last couple of years. So we've got cellular tracking technologies now and radio transmitters that can be put on smaller birds. There's also some really cool technology that's been added to geolocators. For example, I've seen some recent studies using barometric pressure that can increase the accuracy of the location estimations for that. And so from my standpoint, there have been a few really cool things that have happened in terms of reducing the size and things that could help improve our accuracy moving forward.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Next, do you know what percentage of the breeding habitat is on DoD lands?
Yeah, I don't know that number immediately off the top of my head, but can easily get that if the person who asked that question would like to send them an email.
Okay, great. And just a reminder to our audience that the emails are in the slides that you can download from the webinar webpage, SERDP and ESTCP. And we'll show them right here once more. Okay, thank you very much to both speakers, Ashley and John, for that presentation. At this time, we'd like to bring back the speakers from the first presentation, Allison and Bill. We have a question that applies to both presentations. So Allison, we'll start with you. So first, with respect to what you talked about, some of the species that you were talking about occur on lands that are not managed by the Department of Defense. And if those lands are not participating in coordinated management actions, can you speak to how worthwhile it is for DoD to do so?
Yeah, so I think in our case, some of the sort of ideas that we talked about asynchrony, it doesn't matter what other bases are doing. So for example, if you have coordinated management actions between two jurisdictions, that are owned by the Department of Defense, one burns in 1 year, one burns in the next year, or does some other management action that enforces asynchrony between those two jurisdictions, that will still improve extinction, reduce extinction risk. So improve the fate of the species, even if some other jurisdiction, even that's, you know, physically between them or something is not sort of engaging in that coordinated management, it'll still help. Yeah.
Okay. Great. That makes sense. And so there's a similar question then for Ashley and John. If the birds are migrating on and off DoD lands, can you talk about the value of DoD management actions for those species?
Yeah, I'll take that first, and then if John wants to follow up, I'll let him ring in too. In looking at the distribution of warbler breeding habitat in Texas, I don't think the importance of off-post land and off-post habitat can be overemphasized. There's a lot more off than there is on post, and so it's incredibly important that we preserve and protect warbler habitat off post, and that's incredibly important from my standpoint. John?
Yes, I'm here. Fort Cavazos currently has about 20,000 hectares of golden cheek warbler habitat. We have the largest single golden cheek warbler population under a single management regime. So I don't think we can overestimate or overemphasize the importance that the Department of Defense has not only on the golden cheek warbler, but red-cockaded woodpeckers, gopher tortoises. I mean, the list goes on and on. So even though off-post land is very important, the land that the Department of Defense manages is critical in many cases.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We have a question for Ashley and John. So we'll start with Ashley. Did the geolocation warbler data reveal any new information about preferred locations or structure of the ash juniper?
So the question is, did the geolocator data tell us anything about habitat conditions on the breeding grounds?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay. No, not in terms of specific habitat conditions, and there's been a lot of research on golden cheek warblers over the years talking about what requirements they have and what they need on the ground. And that has in part to do with the accuracy of the geolocators, and what specific locations you're able to derive from those light intensity data. John, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think you hit it pretty good. In general, as I mentioned earlier, geolocators are a coarse estimate of the location of where the individuals are throughout the season. And our purpose in this study was not to investigate more of where they are on the breeding range, because we already know that. So we focused more on once they left the breeding sites. And in addition, as I mentioned, the accuracy of these are about 50 to 150 kilometers, depending on the period of the year. So as far as being able to differentiate the exact habitat they're in, geolocators are not the answer, at least the ones that I use. But Ashley alluded to this earlier. They do have new geolocators since we did this project that does add barometric pressure to the recordings, which will bring the accuracy overall down to about 30 kilometers.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. Thank you. And then we have one final question for both of you. We received a couple of questions about genetic studies. So starting with Allison, it might be a little bit out of the scope of your topic, but have any genetic studies been done to determine whether migration from one jurisdiction to another is occurring?
So we have not done that work, but people at the North Carolina Botanical Garden and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill are working on this. And I don't think that we have seen those results yet. So I'm not sure what they're going to find. Bill, do you have any other information here? Sorry.
We don't currently have any genetic information. We have grown fly traps from different populations across the range and see striking morphological differences in the shape of the traps and the color of the traps, which suggests very limited dispersal and genetic isolation of populations. But it will be interesting to see what the NC Botanical Garden and UNC project comes up with about the degree of migration.
Yes, okay, great. And then same question or similar question, Ashley and Sean, have any genetic studies been conducted or will they be, for example, to maybe determine migratory connectivity?
So genetics weren't included in our particular project. I know that there is another group led up by Jerry Athbury, who is working on genetics on the breeding grounds and so there is a genetic study, but it was not a component of our project.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And thank you to all four of the speakers today. We really appreciate your presentations and then answering all of the questions. Our next webinar for this series is in 2 weeks on Thursday, November 16th, and that will be on surveys for munitions detection and localization in shallow water. Registration is open for this webinar, so please visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register. And you can also register for other webinars throughout next year. And before we conclude, I'd like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the slides from today's webinar will be archived on the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage in case you want to refer to them in the future. And we would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you.